How's it going, y'all? This is Sam Richards with the Richardson Fire Department, and today we're going to be talking about the Tokyo sarin gas attacks. So this incident occurred on March 20th, 1995, and it was 5 cult members. They each released approximately 900 milliliters of sarin gas strategically throughout the Tokyo subway system. They did this by having the sarin packaged in these plastic bags and then around a box, and they used a sharpened umbrella to casually poke holes in through it, just to slowly release that sarin as it made its rounds throughout the city. This occurred during the peak rush hour traffic. They did this for the highest number of casualties, and all that resulted in 13 dead, over 1,000 critically ill, and around 4,000 affected to a lesser degree. So Oshoko Asahara, he was the leader of this whole event, and he ran the Amu Shinriko, which was their religious cult. Their core belief was spiritual superiority, and they wanted to save the world, but by doing that, they had to first destroy it. Some things about this Asahara guy. He kind of went down this path by, he ran a small pharmaceutical company, and his big thing was he was selling these snake oils that made all these promises and healing powers and all that. And it never really lived up to the expectations he was saying it was. He was eventually found to be a fraud and was arrested. So while he was in jail, he got real spiritual, primarily in Buddhism, and he developed a spite for his government, and it just all spiraled downhill from there. So sarin gas is a man-made nerve agent. It originated from Nazi Germany, and it was originally developed to be intended to be used as a fertilizer. It's an organophosphate, which inhibits the acetylcholine esterase, which effectively takes out the recipient's neurotransmitters. And what makes it so deadly is that it's colorless and odorless, so if affected with sarin, you're more than likely not going to know it until symptoms have set in, and it could be too late. So an exposure to sarin, if it's mild, you'll have rhinorrhea, which is more commonly referred to as just a runny nose. You could have chest tightness and blurred vision. Moderate exposures, you're looking at more difficulty breathing, nausea, vomit, drooling, and a generalized weakness. And then for a severe case, you've got a loss of consciousness, convulsions, paralysis, respiratory failure, and then eventually death. Respiratory failure being the most common fatal side effect. And all these are the typical nerve agent exposure signs and symptoms, being sludgem and dumbbells, which is salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastric upset, emesis, and meiosis. So treatments for an exposure, you'd want to decontaminate. You can do all the treatments in the world, but if you're still have that sarin exposure on you, it's just going to keep giving you those side effects. So decontamination first. You're going to want to secure the airway, ideally with an ET tube. You could probably get away with an eye gel, but if that patient's got a severe exposure and they start trending downwards, they go unconscious, they can't protect their own airway, ideally you'd really rather have an ET tube in there. And then on top of that, you'd want to do given positive pressure ventilations with a BVM. The only antidote to a sarin exposure would be atropine. So ideally you'd have that on hand as well. If you don't carry it on your ambulance, it's going to be at every hospital though. So for the immediate response, these hospitals, they open their ER doors to the masses. They were taking in tons of casualties that they weren't prepared for, and they did a pretty good job. And atropine was delivered appropriately. They saved their supplies for the more more severe patients that actually needed it. They weren't just handing it out to everybody. So they rationed that out appropriately. And then some challenges they faced, that the first responders were unaware to the chemical attacks. There was some responding units that were under the impression that there was a fire at the subway, so they were completely unprepared. And then secondary contaminations at the hospitals, there wasn't a great job of decon in the field, and so that was then transported to the hospitals. Inadequate PPE for first responders. Some of them, they thought they were responding to a fire, so they were just in their regular turnouts, which is, would be the equivalent of a Class D uniform. And an insufficient supply of atropine. Nobody was prepared for this attack. Nobody carried atropine to this extent to be able to give to thousands of patients. And limited communications between the responders and the hospitals. That seems to be a pretty common trend with mass casualty incidents, with so many patients, so many responders. A lot of people aren't completely sure what the plan is, because it's hard to be prepared for an incident like this. There's just so many moving parts, so communications tends to be a rough spot in these events. And so with that secondary contaminations, the hospitals weren't prepared for this type of exposure. This was sort of a first for the world in a lot of ways. So you were having patients that weren't properly decontaminated by the first responders on scene. Then you also had several patients that they self-extricated themselves and just took themselves to the nearest hospital. And so they had no decontamination at all. They were, essentially turned the ER into its own small-scale hot zone. And with the triage problems, you had all those people self-extricating themselves, which in one sense was good. It did clear up, hundreds of patients for the first responders to make that triage more efficiently. Find the downed patients, the yellow, red, and black patients, and be able to sort them out for treatment easier. But then all those self-extricated patients, that's what really overwhelmed the hospitals and ended up creating a delay for the critically ill patients. There was a severe lack of triage protocols. An event like this really wasn't planned for to that big of a degree. So they were kind of figuring out things as they were going. And another big one was that at the time Japanese EMS was unable to perform advanced airway treatment. So being able to get that endotracheal tube in, that wasn't even an option for most of them. So some things that could be improved would be preparedness, better training, better dispersed PPE, and more atropine. They might have thought they were given enough atropine. They're probably always going to need more. And then decontamination before the hospital entry. Clean them off, get them out of that contaminated clothes, so you're not creating a second hot zone. And then communication, which we already talked about, just a lot of moving parts. It's kind of a tough one to do effectively, but it was pretty poor. So for a global response, it became a pretty big deal to adapt new hazmat and CBRN protocols. So in your local area, if something like this was to happen, you at least had somewhat of a plan. The biggest change was that EMS and hospitals really started stockpiling atropine. And first responders, they got better standards and training for PPE and how to respond to this event. So conclusion, this was kind of a wake up for the world as far as chemical and terrorism preparedness, how to train, prepare, respond to these events, and it kind of shaped the guide to modern hazmat and sea burn responses.